A nurse left work and headed home, but she never made it there. At first, police had no leads to go on, and it seemed like solving this case would be impossible. But soon, they started uncovering a series of strange details, and in the end, the truth turned out to be something no one could have expected. Michelle Beets was born on February 22, 1953, in New Zealand. She had an older brother, 2 younger sisters, and loving parents. Michelle grew up as a cheerful, outgoing kid. She loved horseback riding, swimming, and spending time with her friends. At 13, she was accepted into a prestigious girls' school where she worked hard and excelled in her studies. Michelle had always dreamed of helping people and becoming a doctor, so she took her education seriously from an early age. After finishing school, she earned her medical degree and began working at a hospital in Auckland. But eventually, she decided to move to Australia. She settled in Sydney and started working at a large hospital, continuing her career as a nurse. Around the same time, Michelle met a man named David, and the two began dating. Over the years, she worked her way up to become the head of nursing at the hospital, a role she earned through her dedication and passion for the job. At one point, she was even selected to join the medical team assigned to accompany the Pope during his visit to Australia. On April 27, 2010, 57-year-old Michelle started her day like any other, heading out early for her hospital shift and returning home around 6 in the evening. On her way, she also stopped by a local shopping center to pick up some groceries. At about 6:20 p.m., a couple walking their dog down Michelle's street heard a woman screaming. Alarmed, they followed the sound, which led them straight to Michelle's house. They saw a man in a hoodie, wearing a balaclava and carrying a backpack, climbing out from her yard. When they tried to stop him, he took off running and disappeared. As the couple approached the house, they saw a woman lying on the floor of the front veranda. When they got closer and checked for a pulse, they noticed a deep wound across her neck. She was still conscious and turned her head toward them, as if trying to say something, but the injury was too severe for her to make a sound. Before help could arrive, Michelle passed away, and police were called to the scene. The first thing investigators did was confirm the victim's identity. It was indeed Michelle. In addition to the deep cut on her neck, the coroner found multiple stab wounds and clear signs that she had fought desperately to defend herself. At first, detectives suspected it might have been a robbery gone wrong. Judging by the scene, it looked like Michelle was attacked the moment she stepped onto the veranda with her grocery bags. They theorized she might have surprised a burglar, who then killed her in a panic. That idea seemed to make sense. After all, the back door showed clear signs of forced entry. But as soon as investigators looked closer, that theory began to fall apart. There were no traces of the intruder inside, and nothing in the house was missing. Then, they found something even more telling. Someone had cut the power lines outside, completely shutting off electricity to the house, including the alarm system. The security company was immediately alerted and tried calling both Michelle's home phone and her cell, but she didn't pick up. They then reached out to David, who said he was only a few minutes away from the house and would go check it out. When David arrived, the street was already filled with police cars and an ambulance. And when he learned that Michelle had been murdered, he fainted on the spot. Given how brutal the attack was, detectives quickly concluded it was most likely personal. David, naturally, was the first person of interest, especially since he'd said he was nearby at the time. But soon they confirmed his alibi. He'd been in another place during the attack, and there wasn't a single trace of blood on him. So, police cleared him and kept searching for new leads. Unfortunately, there wasn't much to go on. The crime scene offered almost nothing, just a few faint, smudged footprints leading from the house toward a nearby street. Since that matched the direction in which witnesses said the suspect had fled, officers began pulling footage from hundreds of surveillance cameras along the route and beyond. Meanwhile, news of Michelle's murder spread quickly across the city, and it sent shockwaves through her neighborhood. It was an upscale, peaceful area where crime was virtually unheard of, and even petty thefts were rare. Since the killer had left behind almost no trace, detectives started to wonder if this wasn't his first crime, or if he might have had experience in law enforcement or even military. They also suspected he'd been watching Michelle for a while. learning her daily routine. He'd cut the wires leading into the house, which also disabled the motion-activated lights on the veranda. That seemed deliberate. By the time Michelle got home, it was already getting dark, and without that light, the killer could easily hide near the door and wait for her to arrive. While officers combed through surveillance footage looking for the suspect, detectives began interviewing Michelle's friends and colleagues. Staff at the hospital where she worked said there had been issues in the past with certain patients who'd harassed nurses, but investigators found no link between those incidents and Michelle's murder. They also learned that Michelle had once fired an employee for stealing prescription drugs from the hospital storage room, but that lead too went nowhere. However, as detectives kept talking to her coworkers, one name kept coming up again and again: a man named Walter, whose behavior, everyone said, had always been strange. Walter was originally from the United States. He'd come to Australia on a work visa and got a job as a nurse at the same hospital where Michelle worked. She was actually his supervisor, the one who signed off on his employment papers. But just a few months before the murder, Michelle decided not to renew his contract after multiple complaints had been filed against him. Several nurses had reported his inappropriate behavior, and overall, staff were afraid of him. He had a reputation for being short-tempered and unpredictable. In fact, Michelle even asked a colleague to stay in the room with her when she broke the news to Walter that he was being let go, because she was genuinely worried about how he might react. But that wasn't the end of it. After he was fired, Michelle told coworkers she'd seen Walter near her house several times, which understandably terrified her. Detectives quickly realized that Walter might have been stalking her in the days leading up to the murder. They also learned that he had previously served in the U.S. Marine Corps and had extensive combat training. Still, when investigators questioned him, Walter denied having anything to do with Michelle's death. He claimed there had never been any bad blood between them. He said he didn't hold a grudge about losing his job and barely even knew her, since, according to him, they hardly ever interacted at work. Other hospital employees, however, told a very different story. They said Walter and Michelle saw each other almost every day, and that there was definite tension between them. Walter also insisted that he had no reason to hate her, since the only reason he'd wanted to keep the job in the first place was for his visa. But even after being fired, he managed to keep it and continued living in Australia legally. As for the night of the murder, Walter said he'd met his wife at the train station around 7 p.m., and that they'd went home together. He swore he'd never been anywhere near Michelle's house that evening. Police searched his house, but came up empty. Even so, Walter was still their prime suspect. They just didn't have the evidence to nail him yet. And then, just days after Michelle's murder, something eerie happened. Walter ended up in the very same hospital he'd been fired from. He'd suffered some kind of seizure, and the staff, Michelle's own colleagues, had to treat the man everyone already suspected might have killed her. Meanwhile, detectives kept going through hundreds of hours of surveillance footage, and eventually, they caught a break. On one of the recordings from a shopping center less than a mile from Michelle's house, they spotted a man who looked a lot like Walter. The timestamp showed he was there just 10 minutes after the murder. But that wasn't all. The footage also showed him tossing his backpack into a trash bin before walking away. When investigators brought Walter back in and showed him the footage, he didn't seem nervous at all. He admitted it was him on the video, but said he'd just stopped by the mall to run some errands, and that the backpack was old, something he'd been meaning to throw away for a while. Police sent crews out to multiple landfill sites across the city, trying to track down that bag, but came up empty-handed. Despite all the suspicious details, detectives still didn't have enough to charge him with anything. For the next few weeks, investigators struggled to find any new leads. It was starting to look like the killer had completely covered his tracks, and that justice might never come. But then, 3 weeks after the murder, everything changed in the most unexpected way. Walter's wife, Samantha, came forward and told police she was ready to testify against her husband, in exchange for full immunity. According to his wife, Walter hated Michelle for not renewing his contract. He also believed she'd given bad references about him to other hospitals, which made it impossible for him to find another job. He complained about Michelle to his wife, insulted her, and eventually started talking about getting revenge. At first, he told his wife he just wanted to scare Michelle in a very odd way. He said he'd dress up as a Mormon and go to her house to silently hand her a religious pamphlet. Pretty quickly, he shifted into darker territory, claiming he worked for some secret Irish organization that had finally given him permission to kill, and that he'd be paid a lot of money to do it. In the weeks before Michelle's death, he began preparing. He watched her, learning her routines and routes, and called her home phone from payphones more than 30 times to figure out when she was home. He even drove past her house to watch her, often not even trying to hide, and Michelle said she'd spotted him several times. His wife also told police that Walter practiced knife strikes on her and her brother, focusing on how to cut a throat silently, a technique she said he'd learned in the military. He'd take the knife every morning when he woke up, and again before bed, just sitting and staring at it. A few days before the murder, he bought a whole outfit from a thrift store, including gloves, and paid in cash so the purchase couldn't be traced. On the day of the murder, Walter did meet his wife, but not at the train station. They met at the same shopping center where he later threw away his backpack. When she tried to kiss him, he told her not to touch him because he was dirty, then admitted he had just killed Michelle. Walter said he broke a window at Michelle's house and tried to pry open the back door to make it look like a break-in. He also cut the wires leading to the house to disable the porch lights and waited for her to come home. But despite all that planning, something went wrong. Walter had intended to ambush Michelle from behind, but that evening her car broke down, so she had to park on a different spot. When she finally stepped onto the porch, she saw him and screamed. Walter told her he wouldn't hurt her if she stayed quiet. Michelle said, "Okay, I won't scream. I'm just afraid you'll hurt me." Right after that, Walter slashed her throat and stabbed her several times in the upper body. When he saw a couple running toward the house after hearing the scream, he fled. He changed clothes behind a nearby garage, stuffed his bloody outfit and knife into his backpack, and threw it away at the mall. Samantha explained that she hadn't gone to the police sooner because she was terrified, afraid that if she talked, Walter would kill her too. Around that same time, detectives got a call from a journalist who said she had some interesting information to share. She told them she'd met Walter in the early days of the investigation, right after reporters learned that police were starting to suspect him. She got his phone number, and over the next 2 weeks, they spoke several times. During all those conversations, Walter kept insisting he was innocent, until one day, he called her again and said he needed to tell her something unpleasant. He admitted that he had killed Michelle, saying it was a contract killing for a large amount of money. Walter claimed he'd been diagnosed with cancer and wanted to make sure his wife had enough money to return to her home country, Vietnam, and start a business there. The journalist immediately contacted detectives, who, as it turned out, were already interviewing Walter's wife at that very moment. Her brother also confirmed that Walter had practiced knife attacks on him, and even asked him to come along to Michelle's house to act as a lookout during the murder. That was all the police needed to make an arrest. Walter was charged with murder, but refused to plead guilty, and he was sent to jail to await trial. A few months later, guards found him in his cell bleeding heavily and rushed him to the hospital, where doctors managed to save his life. It turned out Walter had done it to himself, so he was placed under close supervision. The trial began about a year and a half after the murder, and Walter still refused to plead guilty. He showed little interest in what was happening and barely participated in the process, leaving everything to his lawyer. His attorney argued that there were no physical pieces of evidence linking Walter to the crime and tried to challenge the statements made by his wife and brother. According to the defense, they had every reason to lie. After all, they had both struck a deal with prosecutors and were granted full immunity. And that wasn't all. As part of the agreement, they were also promised Australian visas. To the defense, that was more than enough motivation to tell the police exactly what they wanted to hear. The lawyer also claimed that Walter had suffered a serious brain injury in a car accident 2 years before the murder and might not have been fully aware of his actions. However, before the trial, Walter underwent a medical evaluation, and experts found no signs of any mental condition that could excuse him from responsibility. The prosecution's main evidence came down to the testimony of Walter's wife and her brother, along with the security footage. Even though there was no physical evidence linking him to the scene, the prosecutor argued that the large amount of circumstantial evidence was more than enough to prove his guilt. According to the prosecution, Walter's motive was simple. He was furious at Michelle for refusing to renew his contract and decided to take revenge. In the end, the jury found him guilty, and in March 2012, Walter was sentenced to life in prison. He showed no emotion whatsoever and barely seemed to register what was happening around him. When the judge asked him to stand for the verdict, he didn't even seem to hear it. His lawyer had to repeat the request. Throughout the trial, though, Walter often smiled and made strange gestures toward Michelle's relatives sitting in the courtroom. After the trial, another disturbing detail came to light. In the United States, Walter had an ex-wife and a child, and he owed them more than $50,000 in unpaid child support. That was one of the reasons he'd clung so tightly to his Australian visa. He didn't want to go back and face those debts. Later, investigators discovered that just a few weeks before Michelle's death, Walter had actually flown to the US, planning to kill his ex-wife. For reasons that remain unknown, he never went through with it and returned to Australia, where he shifted his focus entirely to Michelle. As for his claims about working for a secret Irish organization, detectives found no trace of evidence to support any of it. The same went for his story about having cancer. There wasn't a single medical record confirming that diagnosis. In 2015, Walter tried to appeal the verdict, arguing that the prosecution shouldn't have mentioned his military background during the trial, but his appeal was denied. Walter remained in prison to serve his life sentence, but 5 years later, guards found him dead in his cell, and the autopsy confirmed that he'd done it himself. And with that, the case finally came to an end, but some things about it still feel unsettling. For instance, it's strange how vividly Walter's wife described every detail of the murder, almost as if she'd been there herself. Maybe Walter told her everything in such detail on purpose, so she could cut a deal with police later and secure her visa. Perhaps he knew he'd end up behind bars anyway and decided to make sure his family got something out of it. That could explain why Samantha only came forward 3 weeks after the murder, immediately demanding immunity and visa. In the end, though, Michelle's legacy lived on. In 2012, the government of New South Wales established an annual award in her honor, given to medical staff who've made outstanding contributions to children's healthcare. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.